Hi folks, welcome to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name's Joshua Bissell, and I'm the producer of this weekly podcast, where we tackle topics of abuse prevention and vulnerable sector protection. We're so thankful that you've chosen to spend your time working towards the protection of the vulnerable and safeguarding those who are in our care. We trust that this time will be beneficial to you. Thank you again for joining us for Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. Here's Melodie.
Once again, I want to thank you for joining us for another issue of Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that I'm pretty passionate about. I've spent a lot of time researching this, trying to help understand what the definition of duty of care really means to an organization. Let me tell you a story, and it's a true story that dates back to May of 2014. Lorna Weaver was attacked by a black bear while working with Suncor Energy, base camp near north of Fort McMurray in Alberta. Other workers who were there present with the 36-year-old tried to scare off the animal with air horns, but the noise had no effect. At the time of the attack, there were mixed messages in the media. Who was responsible for this bear attack? Was it the bear? Was it Suncor Energy? Did Lorna not follow the directions and the policies of the organization? The media indicated that Suncor Energy did not provide the training or the bear spray. However, employees of Suncor Energy said they never received any wildlife training. They never received any spray. Suncor Energy was adamant that yes, they did provide training. They had policies on how to deal with wildlife, and they provided every one of their employees with bear spray. After completing the investigation, the media reported that Suncor Energy is now bringing in mandatory wildlife training for all of its oil sand workers in northern Alberta. The media said, and I'm going to read this for you, I think that the real wake-up call for people working in industry, said Kim Titchener, owner of Bear Safety and More. She has offered this wildlife training for nearly a decade, now almost 2 decades. If you work in bear country, she said, you have to take bear safety training. You have to provide bear safety accessible spray and have tools to keep bears out of your facilities and venues. That was reported in the Global News Calgary, November 18, 2014. Suncor spokespeople said the company reviewed its training practices following Lorna's death. However, it took tragic death for the training to really become mandatory. In 2011, wildlife officers killed 145 black bears located near the oil sands. Should it take a tragedy in a camp to make the changes? Can we not learn from the tragedy that happened in 2014? At Plan to Protect, too often we have people reach out to us and ask for our services and our training after abuse has happened within their organization. Even today, I'm working on a policy on behalf of an organization. They reached out to us after abuse had happened. I'd much rather help you with prevention than response. At Suncor Energy, this training is now mandatory. They're now providing the tools and the resources to protect their staff and their volunteers. They now recognize that they have a duty to care for their staff members. However, I also believe that the employees of Suncor Energy have a duty to care for the organization where they work. Too often, people grumble and complain when they're required to take training. They think they are confident that they will not encounter a black bear, so they don't pack in their backpacks or their pockets the equipment that has been provided to them of the spray and the horns. Either they're too arrogant, too cocky, or they don't think that it's necessary, or they're forgetful. They're not diligent in also providing safety for those that they work with and also for the organization that has employed them. This case really does provide us great lessons on duty of care. The concept of duty of care identifies the relationship that exists between either two persons or a person and an entity like an organization. I spend a lot of time teaching on this topic because I believe that if you're working with the vulnerable sector and people are entrusting the care of children, youth, and vulnerable adults into your care, you have a duty of care to protect both your staff and your volunteers, but your staff and volunteers also have a duty of care, not only to the children, youth, and vulnerable adults with whom they are serving, but they also have a duty of care to their team members, those that they're working with, and the organization that has recruited them or where they are serving. Duty of care identifies the obligations that one owes the other. In particular, the obligation to exercise reasonable care with respect to the interest of the other, including protection from harm, whether that be vicarious liability, litigation, abuse, injury, or harm. The duty of care arises from common law. It is a legal term. It also falls under both municipal, provincial, federal, and international statutes. Both parties have a duty to care for each other. In Suncor's example, the company had a duty to care, to provide training, mandatory training, to provide bear spray, horns, and ensure that their staff and contract workers were actually taking the training and carrying the spray. The employees and contract workers of Suncor actually also have a duty of care. They have a duty of care to Suncor Energy and also a duty of care to their team members. As this black bear attack mars the reputation of Suncor for many years to come, they were held vicariously liable for the actions of their employee. As mentioned at the time of the attack, there was conflicting messages as to who was responsible. If training and spray and supervision and oversight had been offered, apparently it was not often mandatory, or there was no record and documentation to demonstrate that. The definition of vicarious liability, according to the Business Dictionary, obligation that arise from the responsibility of one party with another. For example, a principal is generally liable for the agent's acts performed in the course of the agent's duties. An example of that is if one of your volunteers or staff members harms a child, harms an elderly person while they are serving, or because the relationship was formed as part of serving or volunteering, the organization can be held vicariously responsible. So both parties have a duty of care. As I said, I've spent much time researching this and considering this term and how it impacts plan to protect. I believe both the organization that are our clients have a duty to care for their staff and volunteers, but I also believe staff and volunteers have a duty to care for the organization. The best place to communicate this mutual duty of care is in position descriptions. Often we will have position descriptions or job descriptions for staff members that we're hiring, but do you have position descriptions for volunteer roles? Do you ensure that your position descriptions clearly lay out what the duty of care is on behalf of both parties? According to the dictionary, negligence is a breach of duty of care, which results in loss or injury to the person or entity the duty is owed. Negligence usually includes doing something that an ordinary, reasonable, and prudent person would not do, or not doing something that such a person would do considering the circumstances, situation, and the knowledge of the parties involved. In civil liability, an aggrieved person or entity is entitled to claim damages in court for negligence. To achieve a high standard of protection, Plan to Protect believes organizations, and this is in no particular order, should have the following responsibilities in demonstrating duty of care to their staff and volunteers: managing employee and volunteer recruitment, conduct and performance, so as not to take reasonable responsibility not to put an individual in harm's way, committing to providing a safe and supportive environment for their staff and volunteers, to respect your staff and volunteers, to act responsibly with integrity, to provide mandatory training, to provide the tools and the equipment needed to fulfill the role, to ensuring their practices include effective involvement, establishing and communicating policies, procedures, and parameters for engagement, to clearly communicate if insurance is in place that will provide protection against wrongful allegations of abuse, injury, and harm. I can remember responding to a camp that told me that they didn't care if they had abuse coverage or not. They found it hard to meet the requirements of the insurance company. So they said they were not trying to qualify for abuse coverage, that they were not going to take the effort and energy and the costs involved to ensure that that was in place. My warning to that camp was, if that's a choice you're making, you need to clearly communicate that to your staff and volunteers. Don't let them assume that your insurance will protect them if there's a wrongful allegation of abuse. Another means of demonstrating your duty of care is to provide suitable and safe premises, to recruit that adequate number of staff and volunteers to meet ratios, not to overburden existing personnel, not to stand in the way or interfere when a staff member or volunteer feels they have a legal duty to report abuse, to provide ample notice when a staff member or volunteer is on duty, to provide adequate system of supervision, to believe the best of your employees and volunteers unless history proves otherwise, to maintain good documentation so that if someone is accused of abuse, injury, or harm, that the documentation that you have within the organization will be able to provide demonstration of responsibility that the volunteer took to mitigate that abuse, injury, and harm, to provide clear communication and employee volunteer performance evaluations and reviews, to provide feedback on their service and their activity, to implement strategies to prevent bullying and prevent harassment from occurring from individuals where there's been an imbalance of power, authority, and control. To invest in the professional development of your staff and volunteers, and to show appreciation. Those are just some of the ways that you can demonstrate your duty of care to your staff and volunteers. In most cases, an organization cannot delegate their duty to someone else. They must be able to demonstrate how they adhered to their duty of care. To achieve a high standard of protection, Plan to Protect also believes that staff and volunteers have a duty of care to the organizations where they are working. Here are some ways that volunteers and staff should be asked to demonstrate their duty of care to the organization. Again, this is in no particular order. Being truthful on applications and interviews during the recruitment process. To act with respect for the cause, the mission, and the value of the organization, for the stakeholders, the organization, and the community at large. To act responsibly with integrity. To disclose any criminal activity from the past, or if anything happens during your course of service that involves a violent crime, a crime against children, youth, and vulnerable adults. If you're a driver and you are arrested or you have been charged with a DUI, that should be disclosed to your organization, especially if you drive on behalf of the organization. To update leadership on any changes that occur. Your driver's license, criminal investigations, any convictions. To attend mandatory training, and I'd like to say to attend mandatory training without grumbling and complaining and refusing to do it. To communicate concerns regarding the safety of tools and equipment provided to fulfill the role. In light of COVID and transitioning back from COVID, I think volunteers and staff members have a duty to care both for the children, youth, and vulnerable adults in which that they are serving, but also as for their organization. If you are asked to do testing, do the testing. If you are encouraged to be vaccinated, we would encourage you also to demonstrate your care for your team members and your organization and get the vaccination that is encouraged by your government. Adhere to policies, procedures, and training. Adhere to the parameters that have been put in place for engagement with the vulnerable sector. If you work with children and youth and your organization has policies on interaction outside of program hours or on social media with photography, adhering to those policies, procedures, and parameters. Provide ample notice if you're not able to be present when you are scheduled. Provide written and oral communication to leadership. When anything out of the ordinary happens, fill out those incident report forms. Fill out the suspected abuse report forms. Disclose if you are not physically or mentally able to fulfill your responsibilities, or if you are using any kind of substance that would cause you to be under the control of that substance. To not post things on the internet which could harm the organization's reputation. To believe the best of the organization's leadership unless history proves otherwise. To fulfill your legal duty to report abuse, your ethical duty to report abuse. To raise concerns, voice concerns, put it in writing of any safety issues, and to help your organization be successful. These are not exhaustive lists. However, they do demonstrate that both parties have a responsibility to care for each other and to protect each other from harm. I don't believe many of our organizations will encounter bear attacks, but we have heard similar situations that can happen at camps, overnight retreats. Every organization will face its own type of tragedy, and unfortunately, some tragedies lead out to burnout, emotional harm, injury, and even death. Together, let us all raise the bar on protection and demonstrate our duty to care for each other. It takes a village.